Welcome to the Empathic Mastery Show. I'm your host, Jennifer Moore, and I'm so glad you're here. This is a place where we talk about what it means to be highly sensitive and empathic, how this impacts all aspects of our lives, and we explore tools, resources, and solutions so we can shift from absorbing all the thoughts, feelings, and energy of the world around us to being beacons for calm, love, and healing. I'm so excited to have my friend Sharon Randall here today. Sharon is one of my Wellness Universe friends, and Sharon, like me, is a highly sensitive empathic person and has been on this journey for quite a while and has a lot of really amazing things to share. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring Sharon on today is that Sharon is somebody who comes from and has been working in the corporate world for a really long time. And I know that there are a lot of people who sometimes see like corporate and empath as sort of like oil and water, but I also know that there are tons of highly sensitive empathic people who are working in corporate, and this is something that we need to be talking about because we're everywhere. So Sharon, thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to share my empathic story.
Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about yourself, who you are, what you do?
Well, presently I am still working in the corporate world as a human resource and accounting manager, and I've been doing that for 35 years. So it's been a long time. I'm in the nonprofit world right now. Also, I am a healing mentor for the healing power from within. And I do this as I'm a Reiki master teacher. I'm a grief warrior, a fibromyalgia warrior, a highly sensitive empath, and a chief encouragement officer, because I really love encouraging people on their healing journey.
Well, and I have to say, Sharon, that you really are a chief encouragement officer. You are one of the most generous people with your encouragement and with your support and with your affirmation. And you just always know when to reach out. You leave comments for people and just really, I really think that chief encouragement officer is a very good description of who you are. And I have personally experienced it. And for that, I'm grateful. So Sharon, you know, you talk about being highly sensitive, but one of knowing the conversations that you and I have had a little bit, there was a point in your life where you didn't know that you were highly sensitive and empathic. And so I'd love to go back to the beginning of this and talk about like what was going on for you that like before you knew, like how was it for you? Were there challenges? Like what was it all about for you?
Well, from the time that I was a child, people always said to me, you're too sensitive. You need to toughen up. And I never fully understood what they meant by that. And I experienced bullying for my sensitivity from a teacher, no less.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. So that was disempowering. And gratefully, I had a mom who really understood me, and she didn't allow anybody to like trample all over me, so, but I was so afraid of this woman. And she just picked up on my sensitivities, and I would cry at the drop of a dime, or, I just felt things that I couldn't explain. So fast forward, into my teen years and everything. My parents were divorcing. I was lashing out a little bit, still being called, too sensitive, but I kind of self-medicated in my high school years, if you will. I smoked and I drank.
I think a lot of us highly sensitive, empathic teenagers did.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And I never really felt like I fit in anywhere.
Right.
I was popular. I had a lot of friends. I knew a lot of people. I just never felt like I fit in. Even with my own family, I didn't feel like I fit in. And I remember my father's mother, my grandmother, saying to me when I was a child, she'd say to me, you are a very special person. And I just want you to know that you are beautiful inside and outside. And I'll never forget that. I mean, she had like 13, 14 grandchildren, all of which were my first cousins.
Mm.
And she's sharing this with me. So when I look back at that, I realized she saw something in me. And my mom and her mom, my maternal grandmother, were always there for me. They would always, I call it like protection now. Mm-hmm. They were without, really talking to me and telling me what was going on, because I don't think they really fully understand what was happening with them either.
Right.
And the whole part about intuition, like I was brought up in the 60s, my mom was brought up in the 40s and 50s. And so all of this stuff was like, you didn't talk about this stuff. And then even when my parents were divorcing, you didn't talk about that in the late 70s. So there were a lot of things that I stuffed. I stuffed down a lot of emotions, and like I said, I would go out, I would party. The drinking age was 18 then. I'm just going to qualify that.
Yes, I remember when the drinking age was 18 as well. Yeah.
Doesn't mean I didn't start before that, but I'm just saying.
Yeah. But when the drinking age is 18, that means that the seniors in high school can buy the booze for the rest of us.
Yeah. And I was really careful about that, but I was also responsible because I also had my own car. So I was the designated driver. Mm-hmm. So I was always in a way of trying to take care of people and ignoring myself at the same time. And so with stuffing all of that, what I realize now is a lot of grief of that loss of my parents breaking up. And it was a public, it wasn't a pretty, no breakups are pretty, but it was hard. It was very difficult on my family. My brother's 4 years younger than me. We grew up in the same house, two different ways of looking at things. And I left as soon as I graduated from high school. I couldn't wait to leave, to get out of my house, to get out of the small city I was in and move to a little bit bigger city that had, lots of stuff going on. So I decided not to go to college, to wait a year before I went to college. And I moved with a couple friends to like 45 minutes from where I grew up. And I met and married a year and 5 years later, a guy that I met, and we divorced 4 years later, again, bringing up that loss, not fully understanding why I couldn't process all of this. I just kept going from one thing to another. While I was married is when I realized that I had accounting abilities, meaning I had taken accounting 1 and accounting 2 college courses, and that started my accounting career in the automobile industry. So from there, I went to after my ex-husband and I broke up. It like I said, it wasn't an easy breakup, but I remember he and I were having a huge argument. It was like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning on the phone. And I just remember getting off the phone, dropping to my knees and saying, okay, God, if this is the way it has to be, then I'm going to trust you and just help me to keep moving forward. Mm. So from that point, I started in my career. So I just feel like I've gone from one thing to another. And then shortly after that, a few years later, while I was in the automobile industry as the accounting person, I burnt out fairly quickly from a job that I really liked. I mean, I had an accounting staff of 10 people. I had a great person I worked with. He was one of the best bosses I ever worked with. And I realized that I still never processed any of that, any of that change, any of that loss, I just kept going from one thing to another to another.
Right.
It's like an addict who doesn't know what to do. So they just keep going from one thing to another.
You'd also been told from a very early age, you know, suck it up. You've got to develop a tougher skin. You're overreacting. And I cannot even count the number of times I have literally heard people who are highly sensitive and empathic being told they're too sensitive. It's like every single one of us has been told that at least some point in our life, and that sort of like, oh, get over it, stop worrying about it, stop reacting to it. So it also makes sense to me that if you didn't have anybody other than your mother and grandmother validating that your experience was legitimate and real, that of course you're just going to go through the motions and go from one thing to the next, because you're not even being validated for feeling these feelings. Why wouldn't you just go through the motions? But I'm curious, I'm thinking as I'm listening to the story, I'm thinking about, like, with both your marriage and with the corporate, I'm wondering, in hindsight, how do you imagine that being highly sensitive and empathic affected your marriage and the ability to sustain it? And then also, and maybe even why you chose your husband in the first place. And then also the burnout with corporate. So let's talk about the marriage first, and then we'll talk about the burnout with corporate.
Sure. My marriage, all I ever wanted to be was a wife and mother. And when I met this man, we were both very young. I was 19, he was 20. And I was actually, yes, very young, especially in today's world. You're like, oh my God, I look at them now and I'm like, wow, what a baby I was.
Yeah, you're babies.
And he had difficulties from the get-go. And I ignored a lot of things because actually, and I also grew up in a family where a father was like, oh yeah, you need to be married, you need to be barefoot and pregnant. You know what I mean? That was the attitude. You know, and he was a very loving dad. I don't want to take that away from him, but that was, you know, the way he thought. So it was perfectly acceptable to them that I would want to get married at 19. And I think that for me, because I had so much unprocessed, I just wanted to live that happily ever after life. That's what I wanted. And when I look back now, I'm digressing, but one thing is the morning of my wedding, I was staying at my aunt's house with my mom. And my mom came to me first thing in the morning. I had just woken up. And she looked at me and she goes, "Are you sure you want to do this?"
Oh my goodness.
I said, "Mom, it's my wedding day." And then she goes, "Would you like to take something for your nerves?" And I'm like, no. I'm like, why are you asking me that now? Because then I felt the pressure of, even if I didn't want to go through with it, I felt the pressure of disappointing a lot of people. Because I had a lot of people coming in a couple hours.
So did you have any second thoughts or any doubts?
I did.
Okay.
Actually, I tried to break up with him probably like a month before our wedding. And so I knew something was wrong because, and it had something to do, he and I got in an argument and I had just said, you know what? I don't think this is meant to be. And he cried and begged me not to go. So again, I am, you know, and also an ego-driven, he borderlined on narcissism, but it was, you know, and everything was like, oh no, you can't leave me, you know? And I was like, okay, then we need to work this out. So then we worked it out. But then throughout the 4 years of our marriage, the first 2 years were pretty good. The second 2 years were not so great. And I realized that I was continually stuffing feelings and emotions. And now that I look back, I wasn't sure whose emotions they were. How much of them were they mine? How much of them were my environment that I was in? how much came from my parents. So it was a challenging time, and actually he ended up leaving me, and I didn't know how to. It just really threw me. It broke my heart because I was just like, and I felt unworthy. I felt not good enough for years.
Yeah.
Because I was like, there must be something wrong with me that I can't keep my husband. And then, now that I look back, I'm like, did I really want to keep him? No.
Well, and in hindsight, I look at some of the failed relationships from that point in my late teens and early 20s and even into my early 30s. And I'm so grateful that none of them worked out, because I was making choices as a semi-conscious empath who was a people pleaser and really I was attracted to the projects. I was attracted to the sick puppies, and I really, if somebody like when you said that he got all weepy and teary and cried before, and that's what won you over. It's like, how many of us were highly sensitive and empathic override our own intuition because that emotional appeal, that's there, and it's like as soon as somebody starts expressing or the waterworks turn on, we're just like, oh, how can I help you? How can I make this better? It just fulfills that sense of purpose, I think. So
yes, it does.
Yeah. So what about so it really sounds like what I'm hearing in regards to the marriage is that, one, that you were really young and that you really had this incredible desire, but also that there was a lot of unprocessed emotions. There was a lot of emotions that were your own, a lot of emotions that were your parents. There were a lot of emotions that were coming from your husband. All of it was just kind of this whole thing. And you didn't have any tools or any awareness of how to manage any of it. You just kept putting one foot in front of the other and trying to follow sort of the set of rules that existed back in, I'm imagining the early 80s at this point in time, of what it means to be a, quote, good wife. So it makes, I don't know, it makes total sense to me that you kind of found yourself in this place where suddenly the marriage is not working. So you were saying that sort of motivated you or led you to sort of say, you know what, I'm going to focus on my career and I'm going to make that work. So that actually leads to this other part of the story, which is, so then you kind of doubled down and you went into the auto industry and started working in corporate. You had the best job ever, really fantastic boss, amazing team, and yet still you found yourself burning out. So talking from the perspective of unrecognized empath, and I just want to say, I think this is such a big deal and such a big thing for so many people that I think there are way more empaths in the world that don't know they're empaths and don't know what it's like. So actually, I'd love to talk about what are some of the problems that you were experiencing in work that you now can say, oh, this is because I was a highly sensitive, empathic person, and I just didn't have the words for it or the language for it or the tools for it or anything?
Yes. Well, I can tell you that I'd be sitting in my office having a good, productive day, and all of a sudden I'd be overwhelmed with like an emotion, and I'd be like, what's wrong with me? And not realizing that what I was doing was I was picking up on two of the women who were outside my office, and they would chat all the time, and I didn't realize that I was picking it up. Now, interestingly enough, there was a woman that I worked with. She was my accounts receivable person. She shared with me that she had clairvoyance, and she struggled with that. And I didn't really understand what she was saying, but she said it was really hard because she could pick up people's emotions. Like she knew what I was thinking. So at first I'm thinking, oh my God, that makes me very nervous that she thinks that she's picking up on what I'm thinking. And I think back to our conversation, and I think back to the fact that, there have been a lot of people put in my life to kind of show me what that means. So, and then I would get, when I didn't handle conflict well. So I would try to avoid it if I could. But if it was there, I was this young, late 20-something who could stand up for herself and say, oh no, you're not talking to me like that. And I didn't know where I got it from. All I know is that it was something within me that finally was just saying, no, we're professionals. Why are you talking to me like that? And the other part with the burnout was at the same time, I was also, I had also gone through becoming Catholic. So I was going through divorce, went through the process to become Catholic because I was raised Protestant. And so my faith was also growing at the same time. So I used my faith a lot and I prayed a lot through a lot of things, but still not fully understanding what I was processing. I just didn't get it. I didn't get it at the time. And when I said I burnt out not only from being in my corporate job, but as soon as I became Catholic, I was very involved. And I also had started a singles Catholic group with another friend of mine in the area. I mean, and I was exercising like crazy. It was all of everything together, being a workaholic. And I was raised by workaholics. So, but it's more than just work.
Yeah. Well, it's also that thing of when you don't have validation for the fact that you're picking up thoughts, feelings, and energy from the world around you, and you're being told, develop a tougher skin, suck it up, buttercup, just keep moving. It's like, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, just keep moving, there's nothing to see here. It makes total sense that, especially if you have family members, like you're not the first one like this, that you come from other people, that busyness is a way to manage this when there's nothing else. I mean, I know empaths who are like perpetual knitters, because just having something to kind of keep that energy going so that it's kind of channeled. So it makes complete sense that with the unprocessed grief, with the unprocessed emotions, with all of the things that were going on, that you just were filling your time with everything you could possibly fill it with. It makes complete sense to me. Yeah.
And at that same time, I was experiencing some chronic pain that
I was just going to ask you about the fibro.
Yeah, I was experiencing some chronic pain that no doctor could explain to me. Actually, the one doctor that I had that I was going to, he told me to go see a psychiatrist. Now, interestingly enough, my mom and my grandma both suffered from chronic pain as well. So being the person, the get it done, go for it person, I started doing my own research, and I was seeing a great chiropractor at the time. I've been blessed with great chiropractors. I was seeing a great chiropractor at the time. And he and I together, he helped me to do some research. Like back then there was no Google. So I had to go to the library. I had to go through all the index cards to try to look up what I had. And the initial thing was called fibrositis, which is what my grandmother was told that she had way back when. And it was a result of a car accident for her, and also stuffed emotions and unprocessed grief.
Yeah.
And dealing with an abusive husband, all of those things, verbally abusive, I should say. And so also, I was working, I also work part-time. Well, let me wrap up when I left the job that I had, I was actually being laid off because it was the time, the early 90s, when the Chevrolet sales tanked. So I was working for a Chevrolet dealership. So what was happening is that the owner decided he had one too many managers and one too many admin. So for him, he felt that to get rid of me as the office manager, he didn't want to totally get rid of me. He wanted me to take a lesser position and to take a $10,000 cut in pay. And the controller, who was my boss, said to me, do not take it. He called me in the office. He was so upset. I had already laid off 3 people. I had already asked him if he thought that our jobs were safe. And he said, we can do everybody's job, Sharon. So I feel pretty good that our jobs are good. When he brought me into his office a couple weeks later, the look on his face, he was so visibly upset. Now, this was a fairly quiet, empathic man that I realize now. I mean, he said to me, here, Sharon, I have news that, the owner wants to eliminate your position. He'd like you to stay, take a $10,000 cut in pay, and take, the receivable position. He goes, I don't recommend you take it. He goes, I recommend you just start calling all your contacts. He goes, and you just get another job. So from that point, I was a little soured on the automobile industry. So a little. A little. And I had other job offers in the automobile industry, but I was like, you know what? I didn't want to continue fixing everybody's problems.
Right.
I was kind of tired of it, and I was burnt out from it.
And yet I can only imagine, I'm imagining you heard the term, the geographic cure, where it's like fixing people's problems is not exclusive to the automobile industry by any means.
Exactly.
I want to say hold something up that I'm hearing that it reminds me of a parallel story of my own, which is that I'm seeing how the universe was an agent for things that you would not have been able to do for yourself. That, your husband, you would have stayed, I'm sure, to the bitter end with your husband if he had not left. And
Yes.
even with this job where the universe laid you off, like I've had similar experiences where I'm a Capricorn, and so it's sort of like with my, so like that stoic grip of like, I absolutely refuse to let anything go, that I think that sometimes the universe will do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. And I'm just struck by that theme in your story, where I'm like, oh, I recognize this, where I would have stayed, I would have held on, I would have just, not like muckled onto it and doubled down. And in hindsight, I look at these things and go, oh my God, I'm so grateful that these things did not work out. So it's interesting hearing how you had a similar experience.
I totally identify that. And I can look back to all of this where people were put in my path, the universe stepped in. There were so many things, so many guides. Yes. And I believe that everything happens for a reason, and that we're guided. When I was dealing with the chronic pain and no one could tell me what it was, I was also working part-time in a bookstore. It was a self-improvement bookstore. The owner of it was an entrepreneur. It was, like in the 80s, but I mean, that was a new thing, late 80s, early 90s, and he wanted to go and do the circuit, the motivational speaker circuit. He wrote a book. And I really enjoyed it. It was a part-time job, but I really enjoyed the people I worked with. We really had fun. And I remember a customer coming in, and I remember chatting with her, and we just kind of hit it off. And she was describing some chronic pain that she had. And I said, oh, now this was after I had done a lot of research. And she said, and I said, oh my gosh, you're describing what I have. She reached into her pocketbook and she hands me this pamphlet from the Arthritis Foundation that says fibromyalgia.
Oh.
And I get chills now thinking about it.
Yeah.
I read quickly through it and I was like, oh my gosh, that's it. That's what I have. So that brought me on a whole different self-care journey. So and like you said, there's so many things that come together and there's reasons for everything. And it's what we do with that. Like we could stay stuck and say, oh my God, my husband left me. I'm never going to be worthy. I'm never going to like make it. I'm never going to find another man, you know, blah, blah, blah. But it really is about, I give myself credit for that. And I think it's because of the women in my family that I've seen them just get up and just keep moving forward. And granted, you know, understanding the fibromyalgia piece, working with that, doing my own self-care, that started my self-care journey, my intense self-care journey. And I think sometimes that the fibromyalgia was a blessing.
Yes.
Because it really stopped me.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
It helped me to like really understand the workaholism, I'm still not connecting that I knew that I had empathy because I was able to understand people, but still not connecting being a highly sensitive person and being empathic. I still wasn't connecting it. And I didn't connect it until 5 years ago. And I will tell you that from...
So just thinking about the math, sorry, I just for jumping in here, but just thinking about the math, 5 years ago, we're talking about you started, so you worked in, you know, from the 80s to the 90s, you were working in the automobile industry, working in corporate and dealing with chronic pain and dealing with like a level of like stress and busyness that kept you going. And then you got laid off, and I'm imagining sort of, you know, and ended up kind of going into like you were working at the bookstore. It doesn't necessarily, those details, but we're talking 90s to 2017. So what are like 23 years or something of time between, or at least 20 years of time between when you, that you just like limped along, that you were just like dealing. I can't even imagine, Sharon.
Yeah. And it was, when I look back to all of that, and I do believe it was my faith. It was my faith that kept me strong. I had prayed from the time that I converted for the strength, courage, and wisdom to live my life the best I can according to God's will, just so that I could learn to take it one day at a time. So I give my faith a lot of credit for getting me through all of that time. And in between there, I'd have relationships here and there, most of which, you know, now I realize, and several years ago, were a lot of narcissistic men. And in my 50s, I decided that was my last one.
Go you. Yeah. So I just, you know, I want to acknowledge that, you know, you were talking about fibromyalgia, and I just want to say that I really wonder how many highly sensitive empathic people have contend with fibromyalgia. I know pretty much everybody that I know who has fibromyalgia is an empath. And you know, I definitely see, it seems like many of us deal with some kind of chronic illness, whether it's fibro, whether it's autoimmune issues, whether it's like chronic Lyme or something. You know, it's just, it seems like, and just the fact that I know from my experience as a healer and as doing work with people that if we don't deal with the issue up front, it will find its way to work itself through our body, and it does tend to show up. So you were saying that, so let's sort of, I am imagining that our listeners can imagine 20 years of living with fibromyalgia and, like kind of on a wing and literally on a wing and a prayer, just kind of getting through this process. And then you were saying, I think you and I were having a conversation earlier about how you actually, it was a massage therapist who said to you, hey, Sharon, I think you're an empath. So, like, let's talk about that aha moment of what that was like for you.
Oh my gosh. Relief.
Yeah.
Relief that, oh my gosh, I now understand. I understand so much. In 2015, so what's that, 7 years ago now, I left a job of 13 years working for an awesome nonprofit with an incredible mission. I did not know how to handle stress. I was the accounting manager, human resource manager. I did not know how to handle all the stress around me. I did not know how to handle all of the I was so busy trying to take care of everybody that finally it just came crashing down on me. And my mom said to me, and this was shortly before my mom passed away, almost a year before she passed away, she said to me, Sharon, you need to leave your job. Now, my father would not ever tell me that, but my mom was like, you need to leave your job. But the job wasn't exactly the total problem.
Right.
I still had not, I understood and identified myself and understood why I was so burnt out all the time. Every area of my life, every few years, I'd get burnt out. I didn't understand it. Then when the massage therapist mentioned it to me and I started Googling it, I was like, oh my gosh, this explains a lot, if not everything. And I will tell you that I'm back in the same position. I came back to the same position a couple of years ago, and I came back a different person. I came back, was I still tired and exhausted? Yeah, there was a lot of work to do. But you know what? I understood myself better.
Yeah. I
was able to ask the question, is this my emotion or is this someone else's emotion? Is it the situation that I'm reacting to? I have the ability to ask the questions and also the ability to know that I'm standing in choice now, because I had left a job of 13 years, in my 50s. And, people are like, oh, people can't get jobs in their 50s. You're wrong. I learned that I was highly marketable, and I didn't think that way there. I was depressed. I was like, oh, a monkey could do my job. I was like, didn't value myself, felt unworthy. And then all of a sudden, when I left, I left for another nonprofit that didn't work out so well. And that's okay. That was, but what happened was I got all these other job offers, and I realized how highly marketable I was. And then so that was 2015, 2017, 2 years later, boom, everything came together. I was like, oh my gosh, I get this now. And I learned so many more. Like, I took my prayer and my meditation to a whole new level.
Yes.
I finally understood the concept of the healing power from within. I had discovered Reiki. I had discovered healing energy, and that we all have the healing energy. We don't need to be certified. Yes, it's nice to have the credentials and the certification, but we all have it. And my goal is to help people tap into that, to tap into knowing themselves. And the other reason I started the Facebook group too was because I have found that a lot of women who didn't know they were empaths were coming to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say, I would like you to take this quiz.
Yeah.
And I'd
Yeah.
like you to join my group. I said,
So let's actually talk about what it means, or that thing of like, what are the signs that you recognize, like when you meet people who don't know they're empaths? Like, let's talk about that a little bit of like, what are the signs that somebody should be looking for when they have no idea, like that they're highly sensitive and empathic?
mm-hmm. Well, a lot of it has to do with my own experience.
Yes.
And understanding that, when someone says something and they're sharing something that's very upsetting for them, realizing that I'm able to say to them, you are a highly sensitive person. So I want you to take a step back and to realize that this is not necessarily about you.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it feels like it's about you and it's very upsetting, and I'm not taking that away from you. It is extremely upsetting what has just happened. I said, but for you, to try to understand that there are ways, like I consider being a highly sensitive empath a gift.
Yes.
And that's not always easy to tell people that, because a lot of people are like, I don't want this gift.
Right.
I'm
a
like,
lot of people think it's a curse.
yes. And I'm like, I embraced it.
Yeah.
And this is what I want to encourage other people to do, is to embrace that. So when I see someone who is really struggling, I just say, hey, can we have a little conversation? Can we talk about this? And I'll say, here's what I've discovered about myself
Mm-hmm.
as a highly sensitive person, as an empathic person, as an intuitive person, of trying to navigate the world. I have learned to navigate the world in healthier ways.
Yeah.
Do I have slips? Oh yeah.
Of course. Of course.
It's an ongoing journey. It's not a one and done thing.
Well, and the thing is, right now, the temperature has really gone up a lot energetically, and it's like we are in a global crisis at the moment. And as empaths, it's like, it's sort of like we need more insulation in a way than we did before, because it's much hotter. You said something that I wanted to circle back around about, because I think it's a really important thing, which has to do with empaths avoiding things, and kind of the whole, like, when your mom is like, you got to get rid of that job. I think what I've seen for so many of us, when we're in that first stage of recognizing that there's external things causing our stress, instead of looking at how do we readjust ourselves, a lot of times what I see us doing, or many of us have done, is we exit everything. We remove ourselves from things. We quit the job. We stop eating all the food. We eliminate the household cleaning products. We do all of these things. And I'm not saying use Febreze or whatever,
Right. I get it.
But like I see this happening for so many of us, is that we just keep on peeling away and isolating. And I've seen empaths who get really, really, really like in like a boy in the plastic bubble, because it's like it keeps on coming. And I was thinking, the challenge with this is that when you quit the job, and you said it, it's like, I knew, like, this was not about the job. Like, yeah, the job was the external problem, but the solution was not there. And so I really wanted to draw that out, because I was just thinking about how incredibly hard it is at that stage in the sort of, we know something's going on, and we know there's a connection to the outside world about it, but we don't necessarily know the inner solutions yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. And I so agree with everything that you just said, because we're in a society where it's like, okay, that's not working. Let's just move on to something else.
Move along. Yeah.
And instead of looking internally and being mindful, and I can also tell you that I want to share this. I want to get this out. The fibromyalgia is a lot better for me since I have been navigating the world in a lot healthier ways. But I know my stress levels. I have a great primary care doctor, and I may call her once a year and I said, this is talk me down time, because I'll get like super stressed and I'd be like, okay, help me, because also too okay, you got to add in a pandemic to all of this too, but
Right.
it's also been a constant change. I've been in a constant change for a few years, and not being able to process those changes. And that also adds to the chronic dis-ease in your body. Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing that I notice in people, like people with fibromyalgia, because I created another group, specifically for people with fibromyalgia. And then I changed the group's name to the healing power from within, because of helping people to understand that this is where it has to start. It has to start from within us. And yeah, I was doing, I was doing as much self-care as I knew how to do.
Right.
But then once I understood what being an empath and a highly sensitive person is, and not damning that and saying, I'm going to change that, I embraced it. And I'm like, this is who I am. And it just felt better. And also, I also became a hospice volunteer. So I'm a trained hospice person. So I learned a lot about the grief and loss. I also did a stint as a youth minister as well. And I worked with teens and families. So I was able to help other people work through a lot of grief and loss. So that allowed things to open up for me. And even just recently, about a year ago, I realized that I still had some unprocessed grief that I had not, and I worked with a grief coach, and who was also a corporate coach, which was a bonus for me. It just, having the combination of both. And I was struggling a lot again with work and with stress. Having that combination and having someone like that to talk to, and learning strategies, and also learning about standing in choice, and also knowing and disowning the fact that not every situation is about me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think I really love Don Miguel Ruiz's The Four Agreements. And and just the idea of one of those agreements is don't take anything personally. And I think as human beings, we tend to take everything personally. And so frequently things really are not about us. Sharon, the things that I keep hearing in this amazing story, and sort of the through line for you that is so important, is one is that everything that really ultimately has been the biggest challenge for you has been as a result of unprocessed stuff, but especially unprocessed grief.
Yes.
And I love that you're talking about grief, because I actually personally believe was something I said a long time ago is, when in doubt, grieve. I think that we do anger and fear a lot more easily than we do grief. And I think that we will scare the ever-living S out of ourselves to avoid feeling grief sometimes, because grief just seems to be, I think a lot of people are terrified that if they allow themselves to feel grief, that they're just going to be, it will sweep them away. It will be like a tsunami of grief that they will never, ever, they'll just drown in it. And yet it seems so incredibly, and yet what you're saying, I agree with completely. And so I just keep hearing you talking about like all of these, the realization that again and again and again, that just trying to put your one foot forward and just keep trying to just keep on keeping on was not working. And that the only way through was to lean in and process and accept. And then also that instead of damning being highly sensitive and empathic and, sort of like trying to just like ignore being an empath, that acceptance of your gifts, acceptance of what you are, has really been the only way through. and what I'm really hearing you say is it has been absolutely life-changing for you, that you're not experiencing the same amount of pain that you experienced before. I'm imagining you're a lot happier at this point in time.
Yes. I'm a lot more content than I've ever been in my life.
Yeah. Which is
and
so
also
awesome.
also finding my soul tribe a year ago has been huge.
Yes.
Meeting people like yourself within the wellness universe was an answer to prayer. It kind of it just brought it all together, and this past year has been a real growing experience for me to really and also I've been on a grief awareness journey too. Like, that's my big thing. And also, especially grief in the workplace. I mean, it's like, okay, you get 3 days off and then you get back to work and you do this and you do that. Well, you know what? Grief doesn't work that way. And if I can continue to hold space for people during grief and loss, and also change needs to be grieved too. And sometimes when we just go from one change to another, especially in organizations, especially in corporate world,
right,
there's no time to process.
No.
And all of that stuff that's not processed stays in our bodies. And that's the biggest thing that I learned. And that's what I've always believed about fibromyalgia, was that it was stuffed emotions. I didn't connect that it was unprocessed grief until I lost my parents in 2015 within 7 months of each other. That's
7 months.
That plummeted me. And I left 2 jobs. I left 2 jobs and then lost my parents, and it plummeted me into, it's like my doctor said to me, Sharon, you need to rest. You need to relax. You need to heal. You need to not work for a while. And I was like, whoa. And she'd known me for years.
Within the corporate world, the thing is, as you're talking, I'm thinking about like all of the griefs that are sort of hidden, things like miscarriages or the breakup of, if somebody's, for example, in a polyamorous relationship and somebody has, like, that's one of the most, like, that's I've known people where it's like, if you have a primary partner and that relationship is staying, the idea that, you could be grieving the loss of another or of a friendship. There are so many kinds of relationships that end that we don't get to grieve about because they're not the sanctioned ones. And then even within the context of a bereavement and death, the idea, like, I cannot count the number of widows and widowers who I have spoken to over the years who hit the year mark, and then everybody's like, oh, you should be done with this by now. You should be fine by now. You should be over it. And I just, as you were saying, and then the whole thing within the business world and the work world of compartmentalize, like, there's no space for emotions in business. It's like, this is business. We need to get on with it. And yet what you're saying is, it's like, we are human beings. We are bodies processing things. We are emotional bodies.
Yes.
And it's like, you can't just show up 9 to 5 and put everything away when you are heartbroken. And just, so I love the fact that it sounds like you are being called to really look at and maybe really restructure the whole relationship to bereavement and grief within the workplace. Like, I mean, I'm getting chills just thinking about that, because it's so, it's such an incredibly important thing. So
absolutely
important.
And the grief coach that I work with, that's what she focuses on, is grief in the workplace. And that's her, she wants grief awareness in the workplace. And she's incredible. She was an incredible coach for me. And I took one of her workshops. That's what I did. I took one of her LinkedIn workshops, and I immediately messaged her. I was like, oh my gosh, thank you for sharing this. It was like grieving in the workplace. You know, how do you handle somebody who's grieving? And I was like, oh my gosh. And the other thing that we're grieving, and you've mentioned it a few times. I mean, we're living in a time right now with all of this COVID. There's so much loss. There's so much change.
So much loss.
And there's so much out of control, out of our control, that it's difficult to process it all. And if you say to somebody, like the average person, like even in my family, if I say to them, you know, maybe you should just take a few days off to relax. Nope, I'm fine. I'm fine. Going to keep going. No, I got a lot of work to do. And if I don't do it, nobody's going to do it for me. I'm like, well, guess what? That work is going to be there for you if you take a day off or you don't take a day off. Right. You know, like I just took an extended time off so that I could just regroup. You know, it's about 10 days off. And I'm like, I really needed this time. And this is what I've learned about myself as a highly sensitive empath and dealing with something that's chronic, is that I need these times. I mean, before my doctor, years back, my doctor used to have to put me out a week on bed rest just to get me through. And that's all I could do is work. And I'm tired of just working and not having the energy to do anything else but work. So I'm also learning more about that too, is how can I have more energy outside of work? And I have actually discovered that through Reiki, being a Reiki master teacher, being a healing mentor, discovering the wellness universe. So I feel like everything is moving, is moving in a really awesome direction for me right now. And it feels good. It feels good to be in that place.
I am so glad. And Sharon, it's in hearing your story and just the through line of all of it, I love how willing you've been to look at the journey, to not flinch or look away from the pain, and just how so much of coming to know yourself has really, ignited the healing power within you and really given you the ability to just to be a voice in this world for reason, and also a champion for the empaths in the corporate world, because I'm just really it's like, what if the corporate world could be a completely different place? What if it could be a place where people get to be human and people get to get support? The other thing I wanted to be sure to just draw out is something that you've talked about a lot. And if anybody's listened to last season's interview with Clark and Perdita Strand of The Way of the Rose, you know that I am a big fan of prayer myself, and particularly a fan of using the beads and praying the rosary, but in a sort of really reclaiming it for ourselves. But I wanted to call out the fact that you've spoken about prayer a number of times as we've been speaking. And I just think that willingness to, or that connection to divine source, no matter how we define, God, goddess, that everybody, I believe that we all come to our relationship with the divine. It's very deeply personal, but I really love how you've been that's sort of the thing I kept hearing too, is like, you've prayed for guidance through this entire journey. And something that really reminds me of my own experience too is that the divine timeline has been its timeline, not yours. And that there's been a lot of you spent 20 years in prayer waiting for guidance, and then one day, I'm getting chills and tears are in my eyes, because it's like you spent 20 years in prayer asking for answers. And then one day in 2017, the answer came and you were ready for it. And I wonder even how much of that willingness to be willing and the prayer, the just persistent, constant prayer on your part, was what sort of polished the stone or opened the way, or maybe like the dry soil was so parched that it just softened the soil enough for like the seed to take purchase, like, but I just really love how prayer has been a piece of your story and your journey as well.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't have done any of this. And I always say I don't understand how people can do without prayer.
Yeah.
And actually, I did leave organized religion a few years ago, but my faith and my prayer life has grown by leaps and bounds.
Yes.
Because what you do is you see it on a different level, and you see it without constraints, and you see, and it gives a whole new meaning. For me, it gave a whole new meaning to Jesus dying on that cross for me.
Yes.
Because by that act is what makes us worthy to be loved and to be honored. So, and to heal, honestly, to understand that abundance that God wants us to have in our life. And it includes everything, especially the healing piece.
Yeah.
So for me, I can't do this any other way.
Well, and as you were talking about, the healing piece, you were talking about the need to take time and space. And that is something that I repeatedly have been hearing and seeing, especially as we're sort of we're in this kind of weird, 2 years into a pandemic now. And there was that period in January where everybody was getting COVID, and a number of people that you and I both know were sick with COVID. And it was striking to me how I kept getting this information and sort of this download of like, we are being asked by the universe to have a hard stop right now. Like, in order for us to truly, deeply reboot our systems, to upgrade the systems, and for us to truly, deeply heal, we have to come to a hard stop. And it's so striking, you were talking about family members who are just like, oh, I'm fine. I've got work to do. If I don't do it, it's not going to get done. And you're like, it's going to be there tomorrow. You might as well take the time off. I also personally sometimes ask myself the question, if I, when I'm lying on my deathbed, am I really going to care that I, sent that extra email out? Like, does it matter? Does that extra meme on social media matter? There are things where it's like really just not that important. But it's striking to me the fight that we as a species are having right now about the following basically what feels like the universe's divine instructions, which is slow down, people, stop, pause, rest, heal, and we can't, something I've been hearing lately is, it's like you can't heal a burn in the middle of a burning building. It's like we have to be out of the fire. We have to be out of the intensity in order for the healing to truly happen. And yet this is also so deeply about trusting that that God, Goddess, divine source has a plan for us that does not necessarily mean that we're just going to be left high and dry. And that's scary because we've been so, there's a saying, self-will run riot. As human beings, we have been just like self-will run riot for a long time. And we've just been running around kind of on our own battery packs for quite a while. So I think that trusting is such a process. And yet I'm hearing, or have been hearing in your story also, just this deep sense of acceptance, of trust, of faith, of willingness to follow things and to take space and time for yourself and to honor your inner rhythms and your needs in a way that you did not before.
Absolutely. Yeah. You're right on target. Yeah. I encourage other people to do the same. I encourage people I work with, maybe you need to take a little time. Maybe, oh no, I can't take it. Oh, you know what? And I also come from a point of view, like if something were to happen to us, somebody else would have to come in and do our job.
Exactly.
And also, I'm also a big person on also cross training, because I think we can't live in that bubble. And I've always been that way, even from the time I was a manager in the car dealerships. I cross-trained everybody, because, we need, and even if we look at this from a society point of view, we all need to jump in at some point and support one another and help one another. And how can we do that? And what's the best way to do that?
Well, thinking from the standpoint of how do we live collaboratively as opposed to from the sense of personal ownership, really, and I think that we are in the middle, or we're at I would say more like at the beginning of a global shift, where we're going into a time of cooperation and a time of all boats, the tide rises all boats, like this idea of together we all win, as opposed to I'm going to hold on to my stuff and I'm the owner of this intellectual property and I'm the, like this is mine, know, and Elizabeth Gilbert talks about in her book Big Magic, she talks about how the universe, the muse, hedges their bets all the time by giving the same idea to a whole bunch of different people. And I think that it's this idea of like what's more important is the nurturing of the whole and letting the whole thrive, as opposed to necessarily getting to claim ownership or be like, I'm the one special person who has this one special skill that's going to die off with me. So, yeah.
And I also love what people say when they say that if we can heal ourselves, we're also contributing to healing the planet, to healing those around us and in the world. And to me, that is the most empowering thing, to be able to stand in choice and to be empowered in that way is really incredible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sharon, this has been such a rich conversation. It has been so yummy. And so before we wrap up completely, I was thinking if you had like one word of advice, or actually let's go with two things. One, so if you had a word of advice for the person who is struggling, or like if something to tell somebody who doesn't know they're an empath, what would you say to them? And then the second question is basically what's the most important tool or the most important thing that you can offer to your brother and sister empaths, your fellow empaths?
To the first question, I would say empowerment. Take your power back. Because once you identify that you've given away your power, when you take it back, you're standing in choice and you're empowered and you're going to feel different, and you're going to feel so much better. The second question is, I just want to continue to encourage people on their healing from within journey. And that includes mostly processing grief and loss and understanding what that is in their life, and taking and embracing who they discover themselves to be, because it's who God created us to be. Yeah. And who are we to say, no, I'm not that person. Well, God created each one of us uniquely, and we all are here to serve a purpose, and we're all here to serve for the highest good.
Yes. I just want to unpack process grief just a little bit more. And I want to say, if there was sort of a tool or a way, like what does it really look like to process grief? How do you process grief? Like, what would you suggest to somebody who is brand new in the grief journey and has no idea how to deal with it? What, one thing would you offer or suggest to somebody about that grief process?
Acknowledge it. Acknowledge it. Put a name to it. Reach out for support. Also feel your feelings. Feel them. Cry when you need to. Release.
Yeah.
And also for me, losing my parents, it catapulted me into how do I want to live my life?
Yes.
Because it does create changes. So you can choose to stay stuck in that grief, or you can choose to allow that grief to help you to move forward. Notice I did not say move on. I said move forward.
Thank you. That's a really, really, really important distinction, is moving forward as opposed to moving on, because I think a lot of people do not understand that we never move on. You know, that grief is something that changes us and transforms us. And, you know, I think sometimes it softens with time, but it's never, you know, it's like, it's something that radically changes us. And especially, I think, losing parents is unlike, I actually believe that parents, when our parents die, this was my experience with when my dad died, that I did not know, but when our parents die, suddenly we become the terminal point on the chain, that half of our DNA has crossed over. And there is something very, very, very significant about the fact that half of our DNA, or in your case, all of your DNA, had suddenly crossed over, and you were basically the terminal point on the chain. And I think that is, I mean, if you haven't experienced, it's almost an indescribable experience until you experience it, but it's very, very significant.
Yeah, and I still experience my parents on a spiritual level.
Yes.
And especially my mom and my grandma. I feel that I have, by discovering myself and learning strategies to navigate the world in a healthier way as a highly sensitive empath, I've helped heal those two generations.
Yes, yes. And yes, you were saying that, you know, one of the beauties is as we heal ourselves, we heal the world. I also really believe that as we heal ourselves, we heal our ancestors, and that we can also go back in and do the ancestral healing work, which is so powerful and important, because when we go back in and we do the ancestral healing work, then it's like that work floods forward into our new lines, but also affects and benefits all of the family members and all of the generations that have come after it. It's just so powerful. Sharon, I could talk with you for hours, hours and hours. This has been such a rich conversation. I really appreciate your candor and your journey and just sharing your beautiful heart with us. So Sharon, it has been such a good conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really, really appreciate it.
I just want to thank you too, Jennifer. I so appreciate this opportunity to share my story. It's the first time I've done this in a big way. So I'm glad it was with you, Jennifer. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that we connected.
My pleasure. Thank you. As we come to the end of this episode, I'd love to hear what you're taking from this show. Please jump over to empathicmasteryshow.com to leave your comments. In the show notes, you'll find a link to grab your copy of my Empathic Safety Guide, 3 Basics for Finding Calm in the Eye of the Storm. And while you're there, please subscribe and follow this show. And thank you for your help sharing this show with the people who need it. Please help me to spread the word and send this podcast to friends or family members who need support living as highly sensitive empathic people. Then join me again when the next Empathic Mastery Show airs. Okay, one last time. Hop over to empathicmasteryshow.com for your Empathic Safety Guide. And until next show, shine on. We need you and your gifts here on this planet. So please don't judge your empathic rainbow by colorblind standards.